Okay, so we are going to talk about programming. Not so much programming, but how to do FRC programming and how the team needs to operate. I probably haven't met some of y'all before, but I'm Drew. I live with Taylor because I'm married to her. And I work for First, and I do a lot of software and control system stuff with teams. At events, I'm a First technical advisor, so I help run the field, make sure teams can get connected and all that fun stuff. If you are using your own laptop, you're configured, you've got what you need for right now. If you're working with a school laptop, they've got the stuff on them generally. There's one thing you may have to do with them. We'll talk about it when we get to it. But today we're going to talk about two things primarily. One of those things is Git and GitHub. And the other thing we're going to talk about is VS Code and WPI lib. So that's kind of what we're talking about tonight. How many of you have done the CAD stuff? Okay, so if you've done the CAD stuff, you're probably familiar with one of the problems we have is if you're making a part or making something and you save it and we go to find it later, where is it, right? That's why we have that shared team, shared cloud. Another reason is we never know which laptop you used if you're using the school laptops. So you may come in on Monday, use laptop A, come in on Thursday and use laptop B. We want to make sure that whenever you're doing work, you can save it and get back to it no matter what laptop you used. So the first thing we're going to talk about is this thing called Git. How many of you have ever heard of Git? All right. Have you ever used something and you hated it so much that you're like, I wish I could just make something better than this? That's how Git became a thing. The inventor was using a different software, hated it so much that he fueled his anger into creating Git. So Git is what we call a VCS, a version control software. Okay? And that version control is what's important. It's what lets you save changes, but also have a history. And the history is super important. So in Git, there are probably two big ideas that you're going to worry about. One is called a local, and one is called a remote. I'm going to try to keep this at kind of a high level because we don't need to know so much about how Git works under the hood, but I do want you to have an idea of like when I say words, what they mean. So the local you can think about is your computer. So when you have a file or a document or some code, the local is what's on your computer. The remote is anywhere else. So if that computer is your local, my computer is a remote. So your computer is your local, but every other computer is a remote. And what Git lets you do is sync history between locals and remotes. So if I make changes on my local, I can send it to a remote, which would be your local. Or if you make changes to your local, maybe I can pull those changes to my local. And so it's this idea that you've got changes in one place and you want them in multiple places. And the core kind of component around Git is called the repository. So the repository is the thing you're tracking history of. So if you have a whole program, that program is your repository. If you've got a bunch of Word documents you're working on, that could be a repository. If you're working on a bunch of CSV Excel files, right, that could be a repository. It is just the thing you are working on. And so when we say your local repository, that is the copy of the code you have on your computer. The remote repository is a copy of the code somewhere else. Anybody have any questions on that topic? Like just that idea? There's one thing I said, though, that I do want to take back. It's not a copy of the code. It's really a copy of the history of the code. Because if anybody has a copy of the repository, they don't have a copy of the code right now. They have a copy of the code how it's been every time it's ever been changed. And that's really useful. So if you make 10 changes and I sync my local with your remote, I also can see all 10 changes, when they happened, and the order they happened in. And so that's one of the big benefits of Git here. One of the terms that you'll hear used about Git is that it is distributed. And that's really handy. If my computer gets thrown in the river, I can get a copy of your repository and everything's back as long as I pushed my stuff to you. Any copy of the repository, as long as it's kept in sync with every other copy, can always be used to reproduce it. So if there's a dramatic failure somewhere, as long as there's one good copy, everything is there. It's all safe and you don't lose anything. And the reason I say it's distributed, that's a really good benefit of it, but most people don't use Git distributed. Most people use Git with a single source of truth. And so what they'll do is you'll have a bunch of local copies. Right? So there's 5 of us, there's 5 locals here. They don't ever really talk to each other. They all keep in touch with one single remote. And that's kind of the pattern most people fall into, is that there's one ultimate source of truth, like true pristine copy of the code somewhere, copy of the code's history. And that's where we're all pulling from. This remote usually has a special name. It's usually called Origin. You can call it a lot of different things, just most people tend to call it Origin. And it's the one true, if something happens to every repo out there on the locals, this one is definitely going to be there. And so what happened is a whole bunch of different providers popped up in order to provide a place to host these special remotes. Some of you may have heard of. Bitbucket was one of the first ones, and they're a big industrial enterprise system. So you'll hear things like Bitbucket, which is a solution from Atlassian. There's another one called GitLab, is another popular one. And probably the most popular one even today, even after they've been bought by Microsoft, is GitHub. So GitHub, you can think about as being like the library, right? Everybody wants to take a copy of their code and stick it in GitHub, and you can pull it out and have a copy of it. It's kind of like the Library of Congress for code, if you want to think about it that way. And so that's kind of the big piece of this, is that you will make changes on your computers. You will use Git to save those changes, and then you send those changes up to GitHub. And once it's in GitHub, anybody else on the team can get your changes down. And so that's kind of how we're going to be able to make changes over a long period of time so that you don't lose track of it. It doesn't matter if you save it on your computer, you'll save it to GitHub eventually. Any questions up to that point?